everyone, Dr. Brian Scott with you. We are studying 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 in this Insight to the End Times podcast. We've been looking at where we are in God's timetable, as I've said many, many times. So let's just get right into that verse. It says, know this, in the last days, perilous times will come. 2 days ago, we studied the last days, what that means. And without going into detail, it means we're almost at the very end of the timetable before God is going to turn everything upside down here through the 7 years of tribulation and then bring his son Jesus back to rule and reign for 1,000 years. Perilous times. These are extremely dangerous, cruel times where there's risk and danger and hurt and harm on every corner. Now, as I was saying yesterday, we've seen all kinds of wars in the last century. We've seen for World Wars I and II, we've seen the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Desert Storm, and all kinds of other wars. In fact, right now, if you did a search, a Google search, you would find there's probably, I've done this kind of search before, I haven't done it recently, but you'd find there's dozens and dozens and dozens of wars going on, even as we speak. But what is so different about the war, the perilous times that we're dealing with, is simply this. These wars were always contained in specified areas, like World War I and II, they were both on the European continent. Vietnam War was in Vietnam, etc. But now what we're seeing is perilous times everywhere. We're seeing this in our own public spaces. We're seeing it in our schools. We're seeing it in our malls, in our big shopping centers. We're seeing it in office buildings. We're seeing it just on the street. We're seeing it on residential streets. We're seeing it on the big highways. We're seeing it everywhere. And it doesn't take much of anything to set it off. In fact, just in the last few weeks or last few days, down in the southern states, two homes side by side, the one man in the one house, I'll say it's the house on the left, just for illustration. He's in his backyard firing his rifle for some reason. In the house on the right, there's a family, quite a few people, something like 10 people in the house. There's a newborn. The one family member goes over to the other house to ask the man, would you mind maybe not shooting right now? The noise is keeping our little baby awake. His response, a few moments later, is to go next door, knock on the door, walk in, and he shoots and kills numerous members of the family. And then he disappears, and they did catch him. But totally unprovoked, totally random, fierce harm done, just amazing. And then you'll see where an employee gets laid off at work. And what's he do? Grabs a gun, goes back to work, and begins shooting, killing co-workers. I'm speaking about the randomness that is becoming so prevalent today. You know another thing we're dealing with that's out of control? Drugs. Deadly drugs. Fentanyl is one of the big names today that is killing people. It is so powerful. Drugs are everywhere. We have drug problems all across our nation. We have drug centers that aren't working. We have this, we have that. They're doing everything they know to do in the natural, but it's not solving the problem. They're out of control. People are getting hooked on these drugs, and then they're in trouble. We have death. My gracious, of course, people will die. They get old. We're all getting, or I like to say, we're not getting old, we're getting better. But people get old, they die. That's normal. But what's not normal is the abortion wars going on in both of our countries, here in North America, Canada, and the United States. The severe conflict that exists there between the pro-life and the pro-choice people. In a civilized nation, we have basically a war between these parties. What about euthanasia? Here in Canada, it's almost out of control now. introduced about 10 years ago for extremely people in distress, incurable disease, extreme pain, discomfort, agony. So they introduced medical assistance in dying. They call it MAID, M-A-I-D, but it's being expanded. And they're now saying that it would be applicable for children or teenagers who are having a hard time coping. And just recently, one of the articles that came forth here in our nation of Canada said we should not restrict this from people who are just having a hard time getting by. It would be discrimination not to allow them to have access to MAID. So we have a war going on over the sanctity of life. Now, I know we've had all kinds of things happen in past decades and years and centuries and so on, but the intensification and the frequency and the abnormality of all this is just becoming out of control. It's just crazy. Think about what happened during the pandemic, from March of 2020 through here into the early part of 2023. We have operated in such a degree of fear that it's unprecedented, because it wasn't just North America, it was around the world. And it's sourced, somehow or other, they're still trying to figure out where it's sourced from, but the fear sourced from statements made by a medical individual over in Great Britain who came out and made a statement that had no research behind it, no status behind it or standing behind it, just came out and made a statement. This virus is going to be the most deadly virus the world has ever seen, and the world goes into panic. And approximately a dozen, somehow or other, individuals took over control of the world with all their mandates and all their rules and all their regulations, and people went ballistic. It's been crazy. Now, yeah, we've had viruses before. You probably had the flu once or twice, but we didn't have a response where everybody went crazy. But that's been the case, and it's still mounting up to go again. So my point is simply this. These are times we've never experienced before. They're getting stronger and stronger, more intense and more intense. They're coming with greater frequency. That's what Paul was telling Timothy. We're going to have perilous times, extremely dangerous, wicked type times, and we won't seem to be able to get control of them. And boy, are we in the midst of that right now, which means we're closer and closer and closer than we've ever been to the end. And that means you better get yourself right with Jesus Christ, or you could be in grave danger. I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we get ready to wrap up this week. Thanks so much for joining us. Amen.